There was a street in our town that almost everyone avoided after dark, a crooked road lined with overgrown hedges, cracked sidewalks, and the skeletal remains of buildings long abandoned. At the very end of that street stood a house, dark and silent, its windows staring like empty eye sockets. It wasn't just abandoned, it was forbidden. A place adults whispered about, and children dared each other to approach, but no one truly went inside. The rumors surrounding the house had been growing for decades. Some said a family had vanished there one night without a trace. Others claimed the house had a history of strange accidents, fires that started for no reason, objects thrown from windows in the dead of night, shadows that moved against the grain of reality. Most dismissed it as superstition, the kind of stories people tell to make a decaying structure feel more alive. But the locals, those who had grown up with the house looming at the edge of town, knew better. They said the house had a hunger, a dark awareness that watched those who lingered too long. It was a Friday evening when 4 friends, people like us, ordinary and curious, decided to see the house for themselves. The day had been humid and thick with a heat that refused to let up, the kind that makes every shadow seem heavier, every sound sharper. By the time we reached the street, the sun had already dipped behind the trees, leaving the world in a muted twilight. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves, a smell that seemed to seep from the house itself. The first thing you noticed about the house was its silence. Not the quiet of a place empty of life, but the quiet that feels deliberate, like the world is holding its breath. The paint was blistered and peeling, windows streaked with grime, and the front door sagged on its hinges, inviting yet warning anyone foolish enough to enter. Ivy crept along the walls like black veins, and every step on the cracked pavement beneath our feet sounded unnaturally loud. We laughed nervously as we approached, our flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Inside, we could see the faint outline of furniture, coated in dust, covered with sheets. The air smelled old, like decayed wood and mold, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Every instinct screamed that we shouldn't go in, and yet we did. The first step inside was the worst. The floorboards groaned under our weight, a sound that echoed through the hollow corridors as if the house itself were complaining. The air felt thicker here, heavier, like wading through water. I remember the way the shadows clung to the walls, bending unnaturally, as if they had their own consciousness. There was a feeling of being watched, subtle at first, then more insistent, like something unseen was following our every movement. We explored slowly, trying to make sense of the silence. In the living room, a chandelier hung crookedly, its crystals catching the dim light in fractured patterns, scattering eerie reflections across the walls. On the mantel, a family portrait hung, coated in dust so thick it seemed decades old. But the faces, they were scratched out, not worn with time, not damaged by neglect, but deliberately erased. Whoever had done it had taken care to remove every trace of identity. That detail, small as it seemed, was enough to make us pause. In the kitchen, rusted appliances leaned at odd angles, cupboards gaping open as if someone had fled in a hurry. We joked nervously about what could have caused this, rats, vandals, the usual decay. But even as we laughed, the sense of wrongness never left. One of us pointed out footprints in the dust, too large to belong to any of us. They led from the back door to the hallway, stopping abruptly, as though whoever, or whatever, had made them had vanished into thin air. It was in that hallway that the whispers began. Faint at first, indistinct, barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. We froze. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered. The others nodded, holding their flashlights tighter, scanning the walls. The sound didn't repeat, but the feeling lingered, a presence just beyond perception, hiding in corners and behind doors. We kept moving, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. The stairs to the upper floor were narrow, creaking with every step, but we climbed them anyway, compelled as if by some invisible force. The hallway above was colder, the shadows deeper. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, decorated with floral patterns that seemed almost alive in the flickering light of our torches. Doors lined the corridor, some closed, some hanging from their hinges. Each room we entered was worse than the last, furniture covered in white sheets that were stained, broken mirrors that reflected more than just our faces, and a pervasive smell of decay that seemed to seep into our lungs. And everywhere, that same sensation followed, watching, waiting. It was then that we found the journal. Lying on the floor of what must have been a child's bedroom, its cover worn and leather cracked, the pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was frantic, jagged, as if the author had been writing in fear. We read aloud, our voices barely above whispers, entries describing footsteps in empty rooms, doors that locked on their own, whispers calling names in the night. And then the final entry, abruptly ending mid-sentence, "So hear it outside my door and I." A cold draft swept the hallway, extinguishing our lights for a moment. In the darkness, we froze, hearts pounding, as the sound of something scuttling across the floor above us made us realize we were not alone. Not for the first time, the house reminded us that trespassing wasn't just breaking a law. It was stepping into a living nightmare, and it knew we were here. Even as we backed away toward the stairs, a shiver ran down my spine. The house was older than we could imagine, and darker than any story we'd ever heard. Whatever had happened here, Whatever lingered, it was still present, waiting, watching, and it had already marked us as intruders. The curiosity that brought us here felt foolish now, a dangerous spark that had awakened something better left asleep. And as we descended the stairs, each creak and groan of the old wood sounded like a warning. The house was alive, and it would not forget. The moment we stepped back into the hallway from the child's room, the house seemed to breathe around us. The air was colder here, denser, and every shadow looked like it could shift at any second. Our flashlights flickered as if protesting our intrusion, and in the silence, even the smallest sound, our own breathing, a footstep, a creak of wood, felt amplified, unnatural. We decided to move deeper. Curiosity, the same force that had drawn us here, pushed us forward despite the growing sense of dread. Every door we passed seemed to whisper possibilities, rooms where something could be lurking, waiting. One room, in particular, caught our attention. A door at the far end of the hall that hung slightly ajar. A faint light leaked through the crack, amber and flickering like candlelight. Hesitation gripped us, but we inched closer. I reached out and touched the doorknob, cold, so cold it burned through my glove. Inside the room was almost empty, save for a single rocking chair that moved slowly back and forth, creaking in rhythm with some unseen hand. The light didn't come from a candle, nor any electrical source we could see. It seemed alive, pulsating slightly as though it had a heartbeat. A soft scratching sound echoed from the far corner, and we froze. It wasn't the sound of rats, nor the wind. It was deliberate, measured. Something or someone was moving in the darkness. One of my friends whispered, "It knows we're here." And in that moment, I knew they were right. The house had been waiting, watching, calculating. We backed out of the room, careful not to make a sound. But as we turned toward the hallway, a faint whisper brushed past our ears. Indistinct words, yet unmistakably human. Not a child's voice, not an animal, human. And it came from the staircase leading to the attic. The attic. None of us wanted to go there, but something compelled us upward. A part of our minds screamed to leave, to run back into the safe street outside, to ignore the stories and warnings. But curiosity is a dangerous lure, and the attic called like a siren in the fog. The stairs were steep, narrow, and groaned under our weight. Each step seemed to echo endlessly, bouncing off the walls like a drumbit, counting down to something inevitable. Halfway up, we stopped, staring at the ceiling above. The whispering had grown louder, more urgent, almost pleading. It sounded like a warning, yet carried the undertone of malice. By the time we reached the top, the attic door loomed ahead, darker than the hallway, its surface marred by scratches that looked fresh. Whoever, or whatever, had left them was still near. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. Inside, the attic was cluttered with old furniture, trunks, and layers of dust so thick that each step left a visible imprint. And then we saw it, a small figure crouched in the corner, rocking slightly. Its face was obscured by shadows, but the way it moved was unnatural, jerky, like a puppet controlled by some unseen force. As we watched, a sound came from behind us, a floorboard snapping under weight that didn't belong to any of us. We spun around, flashlight swinging wildly, illuminating the empty hallway. Nothing. The whispers returned louder, almost angry now, echoing through the attic like waves of cold wind. The air was sharp, biting, carrying a metallic tang that made our stomachs churn. Each breath felt like inhaling ice, each heartbeat like a drum in a tomb. And then the figure moved, not toward us, not away. But in a sudden, jerking motion, it disappeared entirely, leaving the corner empty. Panic began to seep into our nerves. The house was no longer merely unsettling, it was active. It played with perception, twisting reality. The rocking chair began moving again, faster this time, as if impatient. Shadows slithered across the walls, sometimes reflecting shapes that weren't in the room. One of my friends whispered that she felt a hand brush her shoulder, though no one was there. We tried to leave the attic, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had decided we weren't ready to leave. I slammed against it, and the wood groaned in protest, but held firm. Behind us, the whispers escalated into fragmented words. "Stay, leave mine." It was impossible to tell whether the house wanted us gone, or wanted to trap us. We moved carefully through the attic, scanning the piles of furniture for exits, for anything we could use to break the door, to escape. That's when we noticed the walls. Symbols carved and etched deep into the wood. Hundreds of tiny lines forming patterns that didn't make sense to us, but seemed ancient, deliberate. Their presence made the air even heavier, pressing down on our chests, and a low, almost imperceptible humming filled the room. A sense of being watched turned into certainty. Every glance toward a shadow felt like an accusation. Every movement made the floorboards creak under more than our weight. And then, a sound from the far side of the attic, soft at first, a whisper of cloth sliding across wood, then louder, more deliberate footsteps, not ours. Something was pacing, circling unseen. Fear had replaced curiosity. The playful daring that had drawn us here was gone, replaced by the pure survival instinct. But even as we backed toward the attic stairs, the whispering continued, almost coaxing, almost hungry. The house wasn't just a structure, it was alive, and it wanted to see how far we would go before breaking. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow detach itself from the wall. It moved against the light, flowing like liquid, forming into shapes that shouldn't exist. My friends screamed, some stumbled, tripping over debris, and I realized something horrifying. The house had made a choice. We were no longer intruders, it had marked us. The decision was ours whether to continue exploring or attempt escape. But in that moment, the attic felt endless, a labyrinth with no exit, and the whispers, now a chorus, grew louder. Stay, stay, stay. We had crossed the threshold, stepped into the heart of something ancient and malevolent, and there was no turning back. Every step deeper would only tighten the grip of the darkness around us. By the time we reached the far end of the attic, the whispers had evolved. No longer mere murmurs, they formed a cadence, like someone speaking in a language just beyond comprehension. Each sound pricked at our minds, tugging at corners of memory we couldn't place. We glanced at one another, wide-eyed, each of us silently acknowledging the fear we all felt but dared not speak. The attic, which had seemed merely cluttered before, now felt alive, breathing with the rhythm of the whispers. Shadows stretched and recoiled across the floor, moving independently of our flashlights. One moment, a pile of old trunks appeared inert. The next, the shadows stretched over them like black smoke, curling and twisting. It was impossible to tell what was real and what was illusion. I felt the first prickling sensation on my skin, like tiny fingers brushing my neck. I whipped my head around, shining the flashlight into every corner. Nothing. But the feeling persisted, climbing from my shoulders down my arms, as if invisible hands were caressing, probing, testing. The others didn't speak, but I could see it on their faces, recognition that we were no longer alone in any conventional sense. We decided to leave the attic. Maybe the house would let us descend if we simply retreated. But as soon as we moved toward the stairs, the shadows on the walls shifted again, forming jagged silhouettes that didn't correspond to our movements. The whispers intensified, forming fragmented phrases. Turn back, leave too late. They were urgent, almost pleading, yet there was something malevolent beneath the cadence, a warning that dared us to ignore it. One of my friends, Tom, turned to look behind us and froze. I followed his gaze, but saw only the attic walls. Then I noticed that the shadows had shifted to form the vague outline of a person crouched in the corner, staring directly at us. Its form was indistinct, blurred, but the presence was unmistakable. It radiated something cold, intelligent, a force that seemed to calculate and anticipate our every move. Panic set in. We tried to descend the stairs again, but it was as if the house itself resisted. The steps ahead appeared farther than they should have, warped by some unseen force. Each movement toward them required more effort, as though invisible hands were holding us back. Behind us, the whispering morphed into low, guttural growls, echoing off the beams and walls, reverberating in a way that set our teeth on edge. We stumbled backward, desperate, seeking a hiding place. There, in the far corner of the attic, was a small doorway partially concealed by hanging sheets and old curtains. It had been invisible before, but now it seemed almost deliberately revealed. Without thinking, we bolted toward it, sliding through the narrow opening into a crawlspace barely big enough to crouch in. The crawlspace smelled of decay and mold, the air thick and suffocating. Every sound we made, every breath, every movement, was amplified tenfold in the confined space. The whispers followed us here too, but now they were closer, almost inside our heads. Why do you come? Why do you not obey? Stay. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed in that crawlspace. Time had lost meaning. The house seemed to pulse around us, each creak and groan in the walls forming a rhythm that set our nerves on edge. We could hear footsteps overhead, pacing slowly, methodically. Sometimes a shadow would flicker along the opening of the crawlspace as if someone, or something, was watching, studying us. Then came the first voice we recognized as human, a whisper, clear and familiar, go now. It wasn't from our group, it came from deep within the house, distant yet compelling, a lifeline threading through the chaos. We exchanged panicked glances, unsure if it was real or a cruel trick of the house. But in our desperation, we followed the instinct it invoked. We had to move. Crawling back through the narrow opening, we emerged into a hallway we hadn't noticed before, one lined with doors that had not been there on the first floor. Each door bore strange markings, symbols carved deeply into the wood. Some were circular, spiraling inward, others jagged and chaotic, almost like scratches. The whispers emanated from behind each door, competing, overlapping, creating a discordant chorus. One door at the very end of the hall seemed to vibrate, pulsing with an energy we could feel through the soles of our shoes. The whispers from behind it were louder, more distinct. Open, see. We froze. The house was baiting us, testing us. One step closer, and the shadows seemed to lean forward, as though reaching. Against my better judgment, I reached for the doorknob, cold like the air in the attic, but tinged with something metallic, sharp. The whispers crescendoed into a high, almost deafening pitch. My hand shook, yet I turned the knob. The door swung open slowly, groaning against its hinges, revealing a room completely devoid of furniture, except for a single mirror that rested on the far wall. The reflection was wrong. It wasn't just our own images. It was distorted, stretched, faces twisted, shadows moving independently of our own. We stepped back instinctively, but the mirror seemed to pull us forward, beckoning, whispering. I heard my own voice, not my own words. At her, stay, belong. A chill ran down my spine. This was no ordinary house. It was sentient, it observed, it manipulated, it toyed with those foolish enough to trespass. And now, as the distorted reflections in the mirror flickered like flames, I realized something terrifying. The house wasn't done with us. It was only beginning. The door to the mirror room slammed shut behind us with a force that shook the walls, leaving us in near total darkness except for the flickering light that seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. The air had grown heavier, almost viscous, making it hard to breathe. We pressed ourselves against the opposite wall, trying to calm our racing hearts, but the house had no intention of allowing stillness. A faint scratching sound began at the baseboards, moving along the edges of the floor like tiny claws on old wood. Then came a low thud from somewhere above, followed by another, rhythmic, deliberate, almost like footsteps pacing on the ceiling. Each sound reverberated through the room, echoing in a way that made it impossible to tell direction or distance. Then we noticed the door on the far side of the room. Unlike any of the others, it was sealed tight with a heavy padlock, rusty and ancient. No amount of jiggling or pushing made it budge. A sense of wrongness radiated from it, as though the door itself were warning us, begging us not to open it. But of course the whispers were louder here, converging into a single, seductive tone. Open? You must see you cannot resist. Tom, ever the brash one, pulled at the lock, ignoring the instinctual dread crawling up our spines. The padlock clanged, stubborn and immovable, but the sound seemed to stir the house. The air quivered, as if responding, and the mirror's surface rippled like liquid. In that reflection, we saw something that wasn't there in the room itself. A shadowy figure kneeling in front of the locked door, head bowed, waiting. The figure moved suddenly, lunging toward the mirror, but vanished the instant we turned our heads. Panic surged. We realized that the house was bending reality, making it impossible to trust our senses. Every reflection, every shadow, every sound could be a trap. We were no longer merely intruders, we were prey in a living nightmare. We backed away from the door, breathing hard, trying to regain composure. Then a soft voice whispered from the other side of the lock. Distorted, almost inhuman. They came, they should not, they see. The padlock rattled as though something on the other side were testing it, probing for weaknesses. Suddenly, the mirror flickered again. In its depths, we saw glimpses of another room, one far older, decayed, filled with strange objects we couldn't identify. Candles burned in impossible colors, casting shadows that moved against the laws of physics. In the corner, a trunk lay open and inside movement. Something wriggled, shifting, almost alive. And then just as abruptly, it vanished, leaving only our terrified reflections. The air in the room thickened further. We could hear whispering all around us now, not just from the mirror or behind the locked door, but from the walls themselves. Turn back, you are not ready. It was a chorus, a hive mind of the house speaking through every surface, every shadow. Our lights flickered, then went out entirely, leaving us in darkness that was more than absence. It was oppressive, almost physical. A cold, invisible hand seemed to brush across my shoulder. I jerked violently, and my flashlight illuminated the mirror again. The reflection had changed. Our faces were twisted, elongated, grotesque, eyes black and mouths open in silent screams. Behind us, a figure crouched low, barely visible yet undeniably present. It mimicked our movements with a delay, a cruel, mocking reflection. Then came a sound from the locked door, scratching, scraping, as if nails were raking across wood from the inside. The whispers intensified, a barrage of overlapping voices, some screaming, some pleading, some laughing. Open, you cannot resist, belong. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a command. Fear overwhelmed us. We realized then that the locked room was the epicenter of the house's malice. Whatever was inside wanted to remain hidden, yet it demanded acknowledgement. It hungered for attention, for intrusion, for us to cross the threshold into its private darkness. The very act of resisting seemed to feed it, to make it stronger. Tom made a decision that none of us could stop. With a grunt, he grabbed an old crowbar leaning against the wall and struck the lock. The metal groaned, sparks flying, and with a final shuddering twist, it gave way. The padlock fell to the floor with a heavy clang, and the whispers cut off abruptly. Silence enveloped the room, deafening in its suddenness. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a space shrouded in darkness. Dust swirled in the air as if disturbed by a sudden gust of wind that came from nowhere. The room was smaller than expected, empty except for a single trunk in the center. On top of it lay a tattered book, its cover blackened, edges charred as if it had been burned and restored countless times. Symbols were etched into the leather, some familiar, others alien, glowing faintly in the dim light. As we approached, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward us, reaching with long, insubstantial fingers. The whispers returned, but now they were singular, a single voice that spoke directly to me. You should not have come here, now you are ours. The air became suffocating, as though the walls themselves had shrunk. Our movements were sluggish, almost as if the house were resisting us physically, pressing down on our limbs, on our chests. Yet we couldn't look away from the book. It seemed to pulse, inviting us, daring us to open it, to peer into the secrets it contained. And then the whisper changed, a hiss layered beneath the words. See what has been hidden, understand what you cannot. My hand shook as I reached toward the book. Every instinct screamed to stop, to run, but the house had drawn us in, and hesitation had become impossible. When my fingers brushed the leather cover, the temperature plummeted. The shadows recoiled, then surged forward in a wave, and the book sprang open of its own accord, pages rustling violently. The symbols inside writhed on the page, forming shapes that made no sense yet spoke directly to our minds. Images flashed behind our eyelids, faces contorted in pain, figures writhing in darkness, endless corridors that twisted back on themselves. A sudden scream, ours, theirs, or something else, echoed through the house. The locked room had revealed its first secret, but it was clear this was only the beginning. The house wasn't merely alive, it was aware. It was feeding on fear. And now we had been chosen as its next participants in a game we didn't yet understand. The moment we stepped back from the trunk and its writhing pages, the room seemed to shift. Dust swirled around us unnaturally, settling in patterns that resembled claw marks or skeletal hands. Shadows crept along the walls, stretching unnervingly long, and for a moment it felt as if the entire house was inhaling, drawing us deeper into its oppressive darkness. It started subtly at first. A chair rocked slightly, though no breeze stirred in the locked room. A picture frame on the wall tilted, then straightened itself, perfectly aligned, as though a silent observer demanded precision. We exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of unspoken fear pressing down on us. The house was alive, we knew now, but it wasn't merely observing. It was interacting, testing, playing. A sudden clatter came from the far corner. I spun my flashlight toward it. An old wardrobe had opened.